Great, thank you. It's very nice to be here. I'm going to talk today about sort of a 20-year initiative to move us towards a collaborative, internationally supported Arctic observing system. And I'm going to focus my examples on the marine environment because that's the topic of this session. But I think what I have to say and show you is broadly applicable across all components of the Arctic system. So I don't need to tell you all, since you've all heard it more eloquently from other people here today, that the Arctic is a critical component of the Earth system. The Arctic drives atmospheric and ocean circulation, but it also has physical, chemical, and ecological impacts on the broader global system. And we've heard a lot about sea level rise, and Arctic change we know is influencing sea level rise, particularly with the melting of the Greenland ice cap and the smaller ice sheets, but also influences mid-latitude weather. And this has been a big topic of discussion, certainly in the United States this year, but also in Canada where I live. And of course, the changing Arctic brings a lot of opportunities, but also a number of emerging issues and threats. So here you can see sort of the projections for global sea level rise here, and a lot of this data is actually coming from stations all around the UK, including in Scotland. And we know that sea level rise is an issue in many places. So why do we need sustained observations? I think that my colleague's comment here about his very long observational record is unusual and exceptional. I know in Canada, where I come from, observational records in the Arctic can be as long as 50 years and as short as one season. A lot of the observational activity that goes on in the Arctic happens under the guise of science, which is great, but as we all know, scientific research tends to be short-term kind of activity, 3-year bursts, 5-year bursts. In the case of freezing icebreakers into the Arctic Ocean, a 1-year activity. That gives us great data, but over a very short period of time. We need long-term observations in order to really understand how the Arctic is changing and what it might look like in the future. It's particularly important because these provide us with information about downstream impacts to other regions and allow us to inform our projections of future change. And all of that, of course, leads us to hopefully developing appropriate solutions for mitigation of Arctic change and adaptation to it. The other thing that long-term observations contribute to is a safe operation of safe operations in the Arctic, whether that's shipping, which we've heard a fair bit about today, to downscale travel for local people who live there, and resource management. So when we think about Arctic observing and sustained observations, what we're really thinking about is a big effort to build or improve upon what already exists, an integrated observing system that's focused around science questions, but also addresses societal needs across the spectrum, whether they're local needs for people in northern communities like Inuit in Canada, or whether they're broader global needs for the shipping industry or for governments. An observing system like this, it really needs to be relevant to people's lives and connected to global observing systems. So some of you might be familiar with things like GOOSE, the Global Ocean Observing System. These kinds of observational systems are not simple to design. Many pieces of them are already in place, and I thought I would show you a couple of examples. But first I want to talk about some of the science challenges around sustained observing. They're the basic science questions that we're all interested in, at least on the science side of things. So in my case, I've provided an example here from Canada. What is the role of Baffin Bay in controlling transformations between the Arctic and the Atlantic Ocean? Of course, and this is broadly applicable to many people in this room who are interested in what will happen in the North Atlantic with respect to fisheries and transportation and all of those kinds of things. But also, how will the melting of the Greenland ice sheet affect meteorological, oceanographic, and biological conditions further to the south, and so on. On the other side of the science challenges, then, we have technical and operational challenges. So how do we get sustained year-round, near real-time observations distributed around the Arctic? To do this requires multiple platforms, whether they're ship-based platforms or space-based platforms or sensors in the bottom of the ocean. And that requires us to have cross-sector engagement. So it's not just the research community that can contribute to building out the infrastructure we have for observing the Arctic. It really does require partnership between academics like myself, the private sector, government, and so on. And then I think importantly, and this is particularly true for those of us who live in the Arctic nations, an integrated and really societally meaningful Arctic observing system or long-term monitoring system must fully include the indigenous people that live in the north and take into account the things that they feel are critical to be monitored and observed and sustained over the long term. So this presents a challenge, a human challenge, as well as a technical challenge. So what is the current state of Arctic observation? I'm just going to give you a couple of examples, one from Canada and one from Alaska. This top image here shows the distribution of northern research stations in Canada. And as you can see, there are quite a few of them in coastal locations. These kind of range from facilities that can provide support to up to 40 scientists to single meteorological stations located in remote areas. But really, there's a huge amount of potential for research activity and for long-term monitoring using these stations. And we would welcome our Scottish colleagues over to work at many of these stations. I would point out that after the first observers in the Canadian Arctic being Inuit, the second sustained observers were actually the many Scottish factors who came over to run the Hudson Bay posts across the country. So we have a long record of Scottish observation in Canada. What we're proposing in Canada now, and this is sitting with the federal government, is in partnership with Denmark and Greenland and some other nations to build an integrated observing system in Baffin Bay that would cover monitoring from the bottom of the seabed to the coastal zone, incorporate communities in monitoring activities both through the inclusion of indigenous and traditional knowledge, but also through community use of contemporary monitoring instrumentation such as environmental sensors and those sorts of things, and then as air and spaceborne monitoring. So we're looking now at trying to create the funding to put this into place, and this is really conceived of as a 30-year monitoring program for the whole Baffin Bay region, which I think, if we're successful in getting this funded, will have real implications for how we understand the whole Arctic system, and certainly for what the impacts of change in this area might be on the North Atlantic. But having said that, despite the fact that we have all of these facilities across the northern part of our country, monitoring is really patchy. So this is from a report that was produced by the federal government in 2014, and it shows monitoring in different parts of Canada. So this is where we have sustained marine water temperature monitoring, and here. And you can probably guess why we have sustained monitoring over here in the Mackenzie Delta, and it's of course tied to the potential for oil and gas development in that region. And then again along here. But then marine fishes, not so much, pretty patchy. And then here's marine water chemistry, again, nice set of data from over here, an array over here, and marine zooplankton. But really, this is kind of the picture for a lot of the Canadian Arctic. It's pretty blank. In the United States, the U.S. has a substantial Arctic observing program. The U.S. Arctic Observing Network, and that, before I moved back to Canada, I was working in the United States at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and that program has been developing really since about the year 2000 into a fairly integrated Arctic environmental monitoring program, focused obviously largely on Alaska, but with strong connections to other parts of the world, including the European Union, and strong partnerships, for example, during the IPY for the development of underwater instrumentation for monitoring the physical and biological properties of the Arctic Ocean under sea ice. But again, monitoring is not necessarily sustained. So this top slide shows you an array of monitoring locations off the northwest coast of Alaska in 2010 and 2011. And here we are in 2014 and 2015, and we can see that there are significantly fewer numbers of monitoring locations. So this is largely the result of the fact that a lot of these activities are supported by 1 or 2 term science research grants as opposed to sustained monitoring funded by different federal agencies, and in my case in Canada would be Fisheries and Oceans Canada or Environment and Climate Change Canada. So the record's patchy and the record is discontinuous. So the research community has been struggling with this patchy observational record for a long time and trying to figure out what are ways that we can resolve this, what are ways that we can build sustained monitoring of the Arctic or sustained observation. And in 2013, the community came together in Vancouver under the guise of the first Arctic Observing Summit. And the goal of the Arctic Observing Summit was to bring together at a high level people involved in Arctic observation monitoring, whether they were from the academic community, from governments, from the private sector, and to come forward with a plan that could be presented to the international community to support monitoring on a large scale and in an integrated way. And that includes the integration of data that comes from monitoring activities. And the main partners in building the Observing Summit were the International Study of Arctic Change, the International Arctic Science Committee, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks Initiative of Arctic Council, and then other groups such as Group on Earth Observations, the WMO, and so on. We've now had 3 Arctic Observing Summits. They get bigger every time we have them. We hold them in conjunction with the International Arctic Science Committee's Arctic Science Summit Week. And they're thematically structured, and I'm not going to go through the themes except to point out that there's always a lot of overlap in things that these very different groups of people think are important. Technology, data sharing, distribution of an observing system that's comprehensive and sustained. And just to show you the level of engagement and who's thinking about putting observational networks or supporting observational networks that are already out in the Arctic, I thought I'd quickly show you a couple of graphs. So these are the 3 summits that we've had to date, and these are the different countries that have participated. Obviously, the Arctic countries tend to have larger representation: USA, the Russian Federation, Norway, Finland, Canada. But each year, participation grows and increasingly more global. They're highly interdisciplinary meetings with representatives from everything from policy and international development agencies to the natural sciences to the engineering sciences and so on. And many different kinds of organizations present, from educational institutions to research institutions to museums, indigenous organizations. In 2016, I'm really pleased to say that we had representatives from all of the permanent participants to Arctic Council. And this is really important because in 2016, the summit came up with a plan for moving forward at an international scale for the implementation and support of an Arctic observing system. And I'd just like to talk a little bit about that, and then I'll stop. They're not typical conferences, so normally there are a number of knotty problems that are brought to the table with experts from around the world to address these problems. So in 2016, one of the issues that was addressed at the summit were key issues in remote sensing. What are the relevant satellite observing systems that already exist, or what's planned? How can those help us build out our understanding and observations of the Arctic, and so on? And I'm not going to read these to you, but I think it's important to understand that this is actually working meetings where the goal is to really move us forward in collaboration on observation. Specific recommendations come out of the summit. So in 2016, one of the recommendations was that SAON should continue to develop and establish an inventory of all Arctic monitoring assets. And in fact, SAON has done that. So if you visit the website, you can look it up by country. You can see what countries are monitoring what and where and what kinds of activities, or you can look it up by sector, so the marine environment or the terrestrial environment. So this has been actually quite a substantial advance in our understanding of what's going on and what's being observed. So where are we now? Components of an international Arctic observing system have been put in place and for at least a decade now. There are bits and pieces of it everywhere. And we're really at the point where we're able to think about how we're going to integrate those different pieces into a single coherent system. But at least many of us have realized that this has to shift from basic research and into more operationalization of an observing system and long-term sustainability. And this is where SAON really comes into play as being an advocate for that. And then the other thing that I think has sometimes been difficult for those of us in the research community to come to terms with is that an observing system has to be about more than just pure research. It also has to be a system that serves stakeholder needs. And those things can happen in the context of a single system. So I don't care about any of the small text on here. It's this recommendation number 2 that I'd like you to focus on. And this was the recommendation that came out of 2016, is that collectively as a community of people, whether we were scientists or indigenous organizations or private sector organizations, the time was ripe to propose to governments around the world the business case for an Arctic Observing Summit. What is the cost of not doing this? What are the benefits of doing it? And that brings us to 2018, where we'll have the 4th summit in Davos, following on the heels of the joint IASC and SCAR science meeting, and we'll be addressing the need, we'll be specifically addressing the business case for a pan-Arctic observing system, the needs, focusing on societal benefits, implementing and optimizing the system, how it should be funded and supported, how data and information should be accessed and made available, and then the use of technology in support of public and private interests in the Arctic, and entrepreneurship and sustained observations. And so I'm going to stop there, and I would say to everybody here who's interested or feels they have a stake in Arctic observation that we hope to see you in Davos with your brilliant ideas for moving us forward as we become increasingly coordinated and collaborative on these kinds of things. Now I'm done.